You think Charlotte Lucas made a calm, rational choice. But what if the entire idea of choice, in her world, was already a controlled illusion? Because before we even talk about Charlotte, we need to ask something more uncomfortable. In a system where survival depends on marriage, can any decision ever be truly free? At first glance, her situation looks simple. A woman, limited resources, uncertain future, and a proposal that most would consider emotionally unfulfilling. The common interpretation is easy: she chose security over love. But that framing already assumes something dangerous, that she had access to both. And that assumption is the first distortion. In the world of pride and prejudice, there is no neutral ground for a woman without wealth or inheritance. Social stability is not a lifestyle choice, it is a distributed system of dependency. Marriage is not romance. It is infrastructure. So here's the first contradiction. We call Charlotte pragmatic. But pragmatism implies freedom of options. What if her pragmatism is actually adaptation under constraint? Because if every path forward leads through marriage, then rejecting one proposal doesn't mean freedom, it just means rerouting toward another version of dependency. And this is where the illusion deepens. Charlotte Lucas is often framed as the archetype of rational survival. But survival inside a constrained system is not the same as autonomy. It is optimization within boundaries you did not design. So the real question shifts. Not, why did she marry Mr. Collins? But, what happens when a human mind starts treating constraint as reality itself? Here's a memory fragment worth holding on to. A sealed letter never sent. A decision made without celebration or regret. Just quiet acceptance, like closing a door that was never meant to open fully in the first place. That is the emotional architecture of Charlotte's world. And here's the deeper tension. If Mr. Collins represents institutional security, predictable, socially validated, structurally approved, then he is not a person in her life. He is a function. A stabilizing node in a system where instability is far more dangerous than dissatisfaction. So the contradiction becomes sharper. We assume she chose him. But what if she was simply responding to the gravitational pull of the system itself? Because in that society, waiting is not neutral. Waiting is decay. Every year without marriage reduces social viability, reduces protection, reduces future options. Time itself becomes a pressure mechanism. And suddenly, Charlotte is no longer an individual making a choice. She is a point inside a network where every variable pushes toward a narrow outcome range. Which leads to a disturbing scale shift. This is no longer about one marriage. It is about how systems define the boundaries of what humans believe they are allowed to want. And here's the revelation beginning to surface. Maybe Charlotte didn't choose safety over love. Maybe she was never operating inside a world where that distinction even existed in a meaningful way. Because when survival is structured through social approval, love becomes a luxury variable, not a foundational one. So now the question changes again. If a system can shape the range of acceptable desire, what part of our decisions are actually ours? And as we step deeper into this, one final contradiction appears. The more rational her choice looks, the less free it becomes. Which leads to a greater question we cannot leave untouched. If every choice is just navigation inside invisible constraints, then who, or what, is really doing the choosing? If Charlotte Lucas is a rational actor inside a constrained system, then we have to ask something more precise now. What exactly is the shape of the system that makes rationality look like surrender? Because the deeper you go, the more unsettling it becomes. This is not a story about one woman choosing marriage. This is a story about how a society converts uncertainty into structure, and then calls that structure choice. And here is where the second layer appears. In her world, social survival is not passive. It is actively measured. Age, inheritance, marital status, these are not personal details. They are market signals. A woman without economic independence is not waiting for love. She is actively depreciating in social value over time. That's the first pressure layer. And it changes everything. Because now we're not asking why Charlotte accepted Mr. Collins. We are asking how long she could afford not to accept someone like him. And here comes the contradiction. We often interpret her decision as emotional compromise. But emotionally, there is no real negotiation happening here. Only timing. Only constraint. Only narrowing paths. So what looks like cold logic may actually be something more severe: response under compression. A memory fragment surfaces here. A quiet dinner table. No argument. No excitement. Just a conversation that ends with agreement before disagreement even has a chance to form. That is what constrained agency looks like when it becomes normalized. Now we expand the scale. Because this is not just Charlotte's psychology. This is systemic design. In Regency society, marriage is not a private contract. It is a stabilizing mechanism for inheritance, property flow, and social order. Which means every personal decision is quietly filtered through institutional necessity. So when Charlotte evaluates her future, she is not choosing between emotional states. She is navigating between acceptable outcomes predefined by the system itself. And here's the escalation. If the system defines what counts as acceptable, then even rebellion becomes predictable. Even refusal becomes temporary. The structure absorbs deviation and waits for time to correct it. This is the hidden architecture. Choice exists only inside a pre-approved range of survival outcomes. Now the revelation deepens. Charlotte Lucas is often described as lacking imagination. But that framing misses something critical. Imagination is irrelevant when the cost of unstructured choice is existential instability. So the real question is not whether she imagined more. It is whether imagination itself was ever economically viable. And that shifts the emotional weight entirely. Because Mr. Collins is not simply a person. He is a predictable endpoint. A stabilizing function inside a system that punishes uncertainty more than dissatisfaction. A system where unpredictability is the true threat, not unhappiness. Now consider this contradiction. If her decision is rational, then it should be replicable. But if it is replicable, then it is not personal, it is structural behavior. Which means Charlotte is not an exception. She is a pattern. A living demonstration of how systems convert pressure into predictable outcomes. And that leads to a more uncomfortable consequence. When enough individuals behave rationally inside the same constraint structure, the system stops needing force. It becomes self-enforcing. People begin to anticipate their limits before they even reach them. That is the moment structure becomes invisible. And here is the scale shift. This is no longer about marriage in 19th century England. This is about how any system, economic, social, or cultural, can shape the boundaries of desire until people mistake constraint for preference. So we arrive at a deeper fracture. If Charlotte's choice is both rational and constrained, then where exactly does individuality begin? Or more unsettlingly, is individuality even the right word for decisions made entirely within engineered limits? And as this question opens, a new mystery emerges beneath everything we thought we understood. If every rational choice is shaped by invisible pressure gradients, how many of our own decisions are simply the system thinking through us? If we follow the logic far enough, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. Not about Charlotte Lucas as a person, but about what her world quietly trains people to become. So the question now is not what she chose. It is what kind of mind she had to develop in order for that choice to feel like the only stable option. Because something changes when a human being lives long enough inside constrained uncertainty. They do not just adapt behaviorally. They begin to adapt cognitively. They start to think in narrower probability ranges. They stop asking what they want in an absolute sense, and start asking what is still survivable. And that is where the real transformation begins. Deep inside Pride and Prejudice, marriage is not just a social contract. It becomes a filtering system for identity itself. It does not only determine who you live with, it determines who you are allowed to become. And here is the contradiction that destabilizes everything. We assume rationality expands freedom. But in Charlotte's environment, rationality does the opposite. It compresses possibility into fewer and fewer acceptable outcomes. A memory fragment appears here. A woman sitting quietly in a room that feels smaller than it should. Not because the room has changed, but because the future has already been mentally measured and reduced. That is what constrained rationality feels like when it becomes internalized. Now the escalation becomes structural. If every woman in that society is implicitly calculating survival probabilities, then the entire social system begins to behave like a distributed algorithm. No central authority is needed. Each individual adjusts independently, but the output converges. This is the hidden intelligence of constrained systems. They do not force decisions. They shape distributions. So Charlotte Lucas is not an anomaly. She is a predictable output of a larger computational structure. And here is where the contradiction sharpens again. If her decision is predictable, then it is not truly hers. But if it is not hers, then what exactly do we mean by decision at all? Now the revelation deepens into something more uncomfortable. What looks like emotional restraint may actually be informational adaptation. She is not suppressing desire in the way we typically assume. She is recalibrating desire to fit within what the system allows to remain stable. Desire itself becomes adjustable. And once desire becomes adjustable, identity stops being fixed. A second memory fragment surfaces. A sealed future that feels acceptable, not because it is fulfilling, but because it is legible. A life that does not surprise the system that contains it. That is the core psychological trade happening beneath the surface. Now we scale upward again. In this framework, Mr. Collins is not just a person offering marriage. He is a stable coordinate in a probabilistic map of survival. Predictable income, predictable status, predictable social recognition. Not good. Not bad. Just statistically reliable. And reliability, in a fragile system, becomes more valuable than meaning. That is the silent inversion. Meaning loses to stability when uncertainty is high enough. So now we reach a more dangerous consequence. If individuals begin optimizing for stability over meaning, then the system no longer needs to restrict them overtly. They will self-select into constrained pathways voluntarily. And from the outside, it will still look like freedom. This is the point where structure becomes invisible not because it disappears, but because it is fully internalized. And here the final contradiction of this layer emerges. If Charlotte Lucas is acting rationally within her constraints, then rationality itself is no longer a path to truth. It becomes a survival language that hides the structure it is operating inside. Which leads to a fracture in understanding. The more logical her world appears, the more it resembles something predetermined. And now a larger mystery opens, one that refuses to settle. If entire societies can produce rational outcomes without explicit control, then where does the system end, and where does the individual begin? If we continue following the structure beneath Charlotte Lucas's decision, we eventually reach a point where the entire system stops looking like a social arrangement and starts looking like a cognitive architecture. So the question now is no longer about whether she had freedom or not. The question becomes, what kind of system turns freedom into something that can only be experienced as constraint? And here is where the first real revelation appears. Charlotte's world does not remove choice. It reorganizes choice into tiers of survival viability. Every option still exists, but each option carries a different survival probability, and those probabilities are socially reinforced rather than explicitly stated. This is the hidden mechanism. Revelation begins here. What looks like personal decision-making is actually probabilistic alignment with social expectation fields. A memory fragment surfaces. A letter never written to challenge the expected outcome. Not because rebellion is impossible, but because rebellion is statistically unprofitable. Now the deeper insight emerges. In such a system, individuals do not directly choose outcomes. They choose risk exposure. And over time, repeated exposure conditions the mind to interpret low-risk pathways as natural preferences. So what we call preference may actually be accumulated exposure bias. This is where Charlotte Lucas becomes structurally significant. She is not simply reacting to social pressure. She is demonstrating how a mind recalibrates its internal definition of acceptable life after prolonged exposure to constraint gradients. And here is the contradiction that reframes everything. If a system is stable enough, it no longer needs enforcement. It only needs repetition. Because repetition transforms external pressure into internal certainty. At that moment, obedience stops feeling like obedience. It feels like clarity. And that is the most efficient form of control that exists. Now the escalation deepens. Mr. Collins is not just a social endpoint. He functions as a stabilization node within a broader structure of inherited property, reputation flow, and gendered economic dependency. His role is not emotional but systemic. He reduces uncertainty in a network that is designed to fear unpredictability more than dissatisfaction. A second memory fragment appears. A quiet acceptance spoken without joy or resistance. Not because the outcome is desired, but because alternative outcomes have been mentally erased by repetition of constraint logic. Now we expand the scale. This is no longer about individual psychology. This is about how entire environments produce what appears to be reasonable behavior, by continuously narrowing the spectrum of perceived reality. And here is the revelation sharpening further. Freedom is not removed in Charlotte's world. It is amortized. Spread out over time until it becomes indistinguishable from inevitability. So individuals do not feel trapped at a single moment. They gradually arrive at acceptance through accumulated normalization. That is the real architecture behind her decision. Not a single choice, but thousands of micro-adjustments that slowly redefine what choice means. And here comes the consequence. If acceptance can be produced gradually, then resistance does not fail. Suddenly, it simply becomes less thinkable over time. Not suppressed. Just less available as a mental category. This shifts the entire structure from social critique to cognitive engineering. Now we step into a larger scale shift. What appears in Charlotte Lucas is not unique to her society. It is a general model for any system where survival is distributed through access, approval, or institutional validation. Wherever those conditions exist, preference itself begins to be shaped upstream of conscious thought. And that leads to the next rupture. If what we call rational adaptation is actually downstream of invisible constraint design, then rationality is not neutral. It is conditioned. And here the final revelation opens only partially, like a door not fully unlocked. Because if rationality can be shaped, then the distinction between what people want and what systems allow them to want begins to dissolve. Which forces a question that reframes everything that came before it. If desire itself can be engineered through structure, then who is the real author of the life we believe we are choosing? If we strip away every surface interpretation, one question remains at the center of everything we have uncovered so far. What is actually being optimized inside Charlotte Lucas's world? Human happiness, or systemic stability? And the moment we ask that, the final layer finally becomes visible. The true revelation is not that Charlotte lacks freedom. It is that freedom was never the optimization target of her environment in the first place. Her world is not designed to maximize personal fulfillment. It is designed to minimize social volatility. Every institution, every expectation, every marital pathway functions as a stabilizer inside a fragile economic and reputational ecosystem. Marriage is not the goal. It is the mechanism that prevents collapse. And once you see that, her decision stops being an emotional event entirely. It becomes a system response. A perfectly normal output from a structure where instability is punished more consistently than dissatisfaction is rewarded. Here is the core revelation. Charlotte Lucas is not choosing between love and security. She is operating inside a framework where love is not a governing variable. It is a non-functional luxury input that cannot compete with structural survival logic. So what she chooses is not a person. It is a stability threshold. A memory fragment appears. A sealed future defined not by joy or sadness, but by predictability. A life that does not demand constant negotiation with uncertainty. A life where tomorrow looks structurally identical to today. That is not emotional compromise. That is systemic convergence. Now the insight expands. In such a system, individuality is not eliminated. It is redistributed into acceptable ranges. People are still unique, but their uniqueness is expressed only within corridors that do not threaten equilibrium. The system does not erase personality. It filters it. This is why Charlotte feels rational instead of tragic inside her own world. Because the system rewards convergence, not deviation. And here is where the contradiction fully stabilizes into clarity. We often assume that constraint creates suffering. But in high constraint environments, constraint can also create psychological relief. Not because it is desirable, but because it reduces the cognitive burden of infinite possibility. Too many options become a form of instability themselves. So the mind adapts. It begins to prefer narrowed reality over expanded uncertainty. And this is the hidden mechanism beneath her behavior. Not oppression in the dramatic sense, but optimization under bounded uncertainty until preference itself becomes a reflection of structure. Now the scale shifts upward again. Charlotte Lucas is no longer a character. She becomes a model for how any system transforms external limitation into internal preference formation. What looks like personal decision-making is actually long-term environmental conditioning compressed into a single moment of visible choice. And this leads to the deeper philosophical rupture. If systems can define the boundaries of acceptable desire, then human agency does not disappear. It becomes dependent on the architecture of options that exist before awareness even begins. A second memory fragment emerges. A quiet realization that no decision ever starts from zero. Every decision begins already inside a shaped landscape, where some futures feel natural and others feel impossible before they are even considered. And now the final consequence appears. If stability becomes the highest value in a system, then meaning is gradually demoted. Not removed. Just made secondary to predictability. Over time, people stop asking what fulfills them and start asking what holds. And once that shift completes, the system no longer needs to enforce anything externally. It becomes self-sustaining through internalized alignment. Which leads to the final philosophical question that cannot be avoided anymore. If a society can shape not only the choices people make, but the kinds of choices they are capable of imagining in the first place, then what remains of free will, beyond the boundaries of what a system allows us to believe is possible? The consequence of Charlotte Lucas's world is not visible at the moment of decision. It becomes visible afterward. Not in what she gains, but in what slowly disappears without being noticed. Because once a system successfully replaces open possibility with structured predictability, the first thing it eliminates is not freedom itself, but the emotional language used to recognize its absence. And that is the most important transformation. Her environment does not create visible victims in the traditional sense. It creates stable outcomes that feel increasingly indistinguishable from personal preference. Over time, what is imposed begins to feel chosen. And what is chosen begins to feel inevitable. This is the silent cost. A memory fragment emerges. A life that continues without rupture. No dramatic loss. No dramatic gain. Just a gradual narrowing of emotional variance until expectation and experience begin to overlap completely. Now the consequence expands beyond Charlotte. Because systems that stabilize survival through structured dependency do not remain confined to individuals. They replicate their logic across entire communities. What begins as marital economics becomes a blueprint for how people evaluate all forms of risk, attachment, and identity. The result is subtle but irreversible. People stop asking what they want in absolute terms. They start asking what version of themselves is viable within existing conditions. And this is where legacy begins. Charlotte Lucas becomes more than a character navigating constraint. She becomes a template for adaptive identity formation under structural limitation. Not a symbol of weakness. Not a symbol of strength. but a demonstration of how consciousness reorganizes itself when uncertainty is too costly to sustain. And here is the deeper legacy. Systems like this do not only shape outcomes, they shape memory. They determine what kinds of lives will later be remembered as reasonable, and what kinds of lives will be dismissed as impractical. A second memory fragment surfaces. A future looking back at a past life and interpreting constraint as wisdom, because the alternative interpretations have already been filtered out by survival necessity. Now the scale shifts further. What appears in Charlotte's world is not unique to her society. It is a recurring pattern in any structure where stability is distributed through conditional access. Whether through economics, status, or institutional approval, the mechanism remains the same: reduce uncertainty until behavior becomes predictable, then call predictability rational. But predictability has a cost that compounds slowly. It reduces the range of imaginable futures. And once that range shrinks far enough, even dissatisfaction loses its direction. People feel discomfort, but cannot locate alternatives that feel real enough to pursue. That is the final stage of systemic legacy. Not control. Not enforcement. But cognitive narrowing so complete that deviation no longer appears as an option worth thinking about. And here is the final reflection inside this layer. Charlotte Lucas does not leave behind a story of triumph or tragedy. She leaves behind a question about how much of human decision-making is shaped before awareness ever enters the frame. Because if every reasonable outcome is produced by filtering mechanisms we do not consciously perceive, then rationality itself becomes something inherited rather than independently generated. A final memory fragment appears. A quiet life that feels coherent, not because it is fully chosen, but because it is fully aligned with what was available to choose. And now the consequence reaches its final expansion. If entire societies can produce coherence through constraint rather than freedom, then the cost of that coherence is not immediately visible in individual lives. It appears later, as a limitation in imagination itself. Which leads to the unresolved fracture. If what survives is always shaped by what systems allow to remain viable, then what parts of human possibility have already been edited out long before we ever get the chance to recognize them? In the end, what remains is not Charlotte Lucas as a character, but Charlotte Lucas as a mirror. A mirror that reflects something far less comfortable than the world she lived in. Because once every layer has been stripped away, what we are left with is not a question about marriage, or social class, or even survival. It is a question about how human beings learn to recognize reality itself. And here is the final insight. Most systems do not need to tell people what to want. They only need to define what is realistically reachable. After that, desire begins to reorganize itself automatically around what can survive inside the boundary of possibility. And when that happens long enough, people stop noticing the boundary at all. A memory fragment surfaces. A quiet life that feels not chosen, not resisted, but naturally aligned with what the world continuously confirms as available. No rupture. No warning. Just coherence that feels like truth. That is the invisible architecture Charlotte Lucas was living inside. And her lasting significance is not that she made a difficult decision. It is that her decision reveals how quickly difficulty becomes normal when alternatives are slowly removed from the field of imagination. This is the legacy that outlives her story. Not a warning written in dramatic collapse, but a quieter inheritance. The way entire generations can begin to mistake adaptation for preference, and preference for identity. Because once a system successfully stabilizes survival pathways, it does something subtle but irreversible. It edits the emotional vocabulary people use to describe their own lives. Words like compromise, practicality, and reasonableness begin to absorb experiences that once would have been named uncertainty, restriction, or loss. And over time, the distinction disappears. A second memory fragment emerges. A moment of stillness where nothing feels wrong, not because everything is right, but because the mind has already learned the limits of what right is allowed to mean. That is the quietest form of transformation. Not change through force. Change through narrowing. And this is where the human meaning becomes unavoidable. Charlotte Lucas is not a historical curiosity. She is a demonstration of how consciousness behaves when it is placed inside a world that gradually converts unpredictability into structure. Not by removing options, but by making only certain options feel emotionally real. So the tragedy, if there is one, is not in what she chose. It is in how easily a world can teach a mind to stop recognizing the space where other choices might have existed. And that is where the philosophical weight settles. Because if reality is not only what exists, but also what feels thinkable, then the most powerful force shaping human life is not decision-making itself, but the invisible shaping of what can be imagined as a decision. A final memory fragment lingers. A sealed horizon that never announces its limits, because it is only discovered after the mind stops looking beyond it. And now everything narrows into one final reflection. If every generation inherits not only conditions but also the boundaries of imagination shaped by those conditions, then the question is no longer about individual freedom or constraint. It becomes something deeper, and far more unsettling, if what we call possible is always pre-shaped before we ever learn to question it. Then how much of human life is lived inside a world that was never fully visible to begin with? And what would it mean to step beyond the edge we were never told existed?